In this lecture, I'm covering a rather wide field, and perhaps the first thing I do find when we do this lecture, and you see the chart up here, and people see the word philosophy, and that causes a slight note of apprehension because they think, well, now, this is going to be very dry. They conjure up a picture of one of those bearded professors. Well, you can see I haven't got the beard. And they carry very heavy tomes under their arm, and they speak in very, shall we say, abstract language which no one can understand. Sometimes I suspect they can't understand themselves. So please be at ease as we come to look at this word, which is absolutely vital to an understanding of what we're going to discuss. The word is derived from the Greek, and in the sense I'm going to use it, because I wouldn't get any marks at all in a philosophy course at a university, but in the sense I'm going to use it, it is the search for wisdom or the search for truth, or to use a layman's term, it is simply, what is your point of view? Now at this stage we find those people who say, well, look, please don't burden me with all that. I'm just a practical sort of a person. You know, all this highfalutin nonsense about philosophy and ideas and points of view, that's quite beyond me. Well, I think we ought to spend a few minutes on this and see how important it is. Some years ago, a very distinguished British ambassador by the name of Sir David Kelly, he'd served in Moscow for many years and was a recognized authority on that totalitarian system we generally call communism. And one of the British popular newspapers asked Sir David Kelly to do a series of articles, but please, Sir David, don't let's have into that philosophy stuff. You see, we're not just popular style readers, and we just want to hear about communism. Well, as Sir David Kelly said, how can you discuss communism if you don't discuss the philosophy of communism? What undergirds communism? And when you look at that, you find, for example, the communist mind is rather different to our mind. In their approach to what is called truth is rather different. We won't go into except to say, in essence, that the Marxist teaches there is only one reality, that is matter. There's no other reality beyond matter. And in fact, you might say, well, that's not very illuminating because we've had a lot of philosophies of materialism, but the great contribution for the communists, the Marxists say, was the great contribution. Marx allegedly was a discoverer of a great law, and it's called, by that rather large mouthful, called the law of dialectics, the essence of which is that matter is constantly in motion and the whole of development takes place through violence. There's no other way to have development except through violence. Now, if you grasp how the communist mind thinks, then you begin to understand why they act as they do. You begin to understand that, for example, it's no use saying to a communist or a very dedicated communist, look, you're telling lies, because he'll return to you and say, look, what I'm saying today furthers Marxism much better than saying the opposite yesterday. So what is true today might contradict what was said yesterday, but that's nothing to do with what I'm about. It's no good saying to a communist and expostulating, look, you murder people, millions of them, because they just simply regard human beings as higher animals. The communists are the highest animals of all. And if you're an elite and you're a higher animal, well then, if you've got to, as they put it, remove some of your fellow animals, that's what they call a social necessity. Now, that's the importance of philosophy. I rather recall the story of the old farmer discussing this, and he said he was a practical man too, and that business philosophy had nothing to do with him. But I said, yes, I said, we've all got a philosophy. So I put this to him. Now I said, supposing your tractor broke down, and you knew your neighbour next door had a brand new tractor. He wasn't home. Why not go and help yourself to his new tractor? Oh, no, he said, I couldn't do that. Why couldn't you do that? He was a bit puzzled why I should put that question. Well, he said, that would be stealing. Well, I said, what's wrong with that? He was even more staggered. Well, he said, that's wrong. Well, I said, what's wrong with stealing? And after a bit of puzzling exchange, I said, you see, sir, you have got a philosophy. You've got a point of view. Your point of view concerning property is one you've been brought up with. You respect your neighbour's property. That's your philosophy. Or you could take it even further, a more extreme case, to Farmer Job Smith, who didn't like his neighbour at all. In fact, you'd have to say hated him. And you say to him, well, look, you've got a good double-barrel shotgun, why not just go down and remove your problem? He threw his arms up in horror. Well, he couldn't do that. Why not? Well, that's murder. Yeah, but what's wrong with that? Oh, well, eventually get down to it. You see, even he believes, much as he disliked his neighbour, he had basic fundamental rights which he derived from God. His life was on lease from God. He had no right to take it, even though he disliked that man. So you see, he had a philosophy too. Now, most of our points of view are inculcated into us. As we grow up, it's part of our culture. And so it is absolutely important we be quite clear about it. And ringing down through the ages still comes that tremendous question. What is truth? What is truth? You'll all recall the gentleman that asked that, he washed his hands of it, a bit too hard for him. But that's the central question of history. What is truth? Well, as Jeremy Lee put it, of course, Christ said he was the truth, he was the way. But there's more to it, of course, than that. What is truth? Now, as we come to ask this question and answer it, the first thing we've got to do is to make up our minds between two points of view. And here I would suggest to you, as Jeremy Lee has put to you, from a Christian point of view at least, the individual who's perhaps the most difficult is that person we call the liberal, the small L liberal. The small L liberal in the main is quite a decent sort of a fellow, but he's quite convinced there's no such thing as absolutes in the sense I'm going to start to talk about them. He constantly talks about what ought to be, how things ought to be. And because they ought to be, and he can think it up in his mind, that's how, in fact, he believes he can make it. I think one of the most important little essays you can read at this time, if you haven't read it, is this one by Malcolm Muggeridge, The Great Liberal Death Wish. A brilliant little essay by one of the masters of the English language, and goes right to the core of this problem, the cleavage between the point of view of those who say, because man in his own mind can think up what ought to be, and he's got something called reason and logic, therefore he can make it be that. But there's the other point of view, which I'm going to put to you very simply: the rules of this universe transcend human thinking. And just from a common sense point of view, apart from any other, the sensible thing to do is to discover what those rules are and then obey the rules. Now, the plight of the world today is a result of the liberal mind, which is the forerunner of the communist mind, constantly saying, well, because we've got something called intelligence, and much else, we can conjure up a world as it ought to be. The liberal in the main is a supporter of utopias. And then, of course, we've got to go on from there as we look at these words, and I'm the first to agree there are difficulties in discussing these matters, and perhaps at question time you'll take up some of these points. People get so taken up with what we call the word, and I regret to say I think many Christians are like this, such concentration on the word, we overlook the fact that a word is a symbol And in reality, what we're concerned is with the truth behind the symbol. And many people get hooked on the word. And that's one of the reasons we get diverted. So the term utopia sounds nice to many people. Or some say, well, look, he's a great idealist. You might think about this. It's been said that the ideal is the enemy of the real. Because the ideal is what the human mind conjures up as what the human mind thinks ought to be. He is the utopianist. And this, of course, raises other questions. The nature of evil itself, because the word evil to many people conjures up things that are nasty, unpleasant. The most dangerous evil in the world is presented in a very pleasant shape. Many of its advocates are very pleasant people as people. You've all met that person we call right down at your local community level, we call the do-gooder. Now, the do-gooder only wants to do good to you, whether you want it done to you or not. And then the next step is very logical. So I can do this good to you, I only want enough power. In other words, we're going to use Caesar to do it to you. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, that has far-reaching consequences, in fact explosive. So this question of words, you can see, is rather important as we come back and ask this question, what is truth? So Muggeridge's great liberal death wish puts this very clearly. In essence, it is between those who accept proper authority and those who don't accept proper authority. Now, the word authority today is one that, again, because of propaganda, conjures up a picture in the minds of many people of something repressive and restrictive and reactionary. I've been just lecturing throughout New Zealand, meeting up with bunches of manipulated kids that are crying their heads off about fascism and so on without understanding what they're talking about, or freedom, or rights. But they've rejected authority. Well, I'll have to explain that when I was a small boy, a very snotty-nosed little kid, I couldn't even play marbles without accepting authority, the authority of the rules. And we all had to agree to accept the rules. We all had to agree that we'd be penalised if we broke the rules. Authority. And as Muggeridge puts it, the ultimate authority, of course, is God. And once we reject the authority of God, we don't have freedom, we have anarchy. These are matters you've got to think about. And as Christians, you've got to equip yourself to be able to argue these points. That if you don't have an orderly society, you have a disorderly society, then there can be no freedom at all. Even down to elementary matters like driving on the roads. If we all said, well, look, I find those road laws very repressive. I think driving on the left-hand side is ridiculous. We ought to drive where we like. Well, of course, you wouldn't have freedom at all. You'd have even greater carnage than you've got now. So we come back to that beautiful statement from a Christian point of view, in whose service is perfect freedom. It's through service to the ultimate authority of God and God's laws that we obtain freedom. So you see, this thing called philosophy is important, isn't it? That's the starting point. What men believe governs what they do. And please may I stress, you've got to get it completely correct, because we were told you don't get figs from thistles. You get thistles from thistles. That being the case, how can you get true policies from untrue philosophy? I well recall many years ago, as a member of the Melbourne Anglican Synod, I put up a motion which caused a great sensation this day, that the Synod should go on record as stressing that the philosophy of Christianity, the undergirding philosophy, and that of Marxism or communism were completely incompatible. And therefore we should proceed from that basis and equip ourselves to defeat what was completely evil. And I'm sorry to tell you, in the great debate that took place, we found that at least half the clergy felt that you could, if you couldn't get figs from thistles, perhaps you might get half figs. You see, there was some good in communism. Now, that's the confusion you got today. The philosophy of communism is completely, and I merely state that, against that of Christianity. Now, what is the undergirding philosophy, the point of view about the Christian revelation? It's very simple to me. Christ did not come to say, as Jeremy Lee put it, save systems. They all exist to serve the individual. Didn't say anything about saving nations, saving groups. The whole thrust was on the individual. Every individual counted. Every individual was a unique person, unlike every other person. That, to me, is one of the most amazing things in the world, if you'll think about it. Everyone is different. And that, of course, raised another controversial question about equality. A lady at my meeting last Monday night in Christchurch, who I'm quite sure believed she was a Christian, was quite outraged when I said I didn't believe in equality. The real meaning of the word equality is no quality at all. We're all reduced to the one dead level. There's only one sphere of human activity I know where you can claim complete pure equality, and that's in the field of pure mathematics. Because not one of you here today is equal to anyone else. You're all different. And Christ's message was to the differences, that we were unique, and everyone could come to know the Father through the Son. Each individual will be governed and judged as an individual. That is why this dreadful talk about group responsibilities are so evil. It's only individuals can be held responsible. Now, that's got awesome responsibilities attached to it, as we'll see. Right down to how you use your vote. We'll be coming back to that. But on the other hand, what a tremendous concept that each one of us can come to know God, love God and serve God, and our uniqueness can be developed if we've got that concept. But we've got to create the right social, economic and other structures so that can be done. I think we can leave that. If you've got any questions, we can come back. But that's the starting point. What is truth? Now, the whole of history can be written around basically 2 points of view concerning what I'm now going to discuss called power. There's only 2, and you've got to make up your mind, what is your philosophy about that? Now, you've got the point of view which says, if we can only concentrate power sufficiently into the hands of an elite of some sort, they in their great wisdom can solve all the problems of mankind. They can, in fact, create a perfect society, overlooking the fact that in the meantime we haven't yet seen any perfect human beings. But nevertheless, that's the point of view. The other point of view is that the only safe place for power is decentralized power right back to the individual. Now, at this stage, many people say to me, well, aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself, Mr. Butler? Before we discuss power, don't you think we should discuss freedom? We can't discuss freedom without power. If you have no power to make any decisions about anything, you have no freedom. Freedom is dependent upon what power or what sovereignty, what self-government you possess. If you don't have that, you have no freedom. You can't make any decisions about anything. So this is the fundamental question we've got to get quite clear. Now, historically, of course, the Christian approach is quite simple. There's no argument about it. It goes back to that incident which Jeremy Lee just briefly touched upon, the temptation on the mount in the wilderness. Now, the temptation there, and the Gospel of St. Matthew, I think, gives you the best description of it, where Christ was taken up on that high mountain and shown the whole world. And there was the temptation. The temptation was, with complete world power, you could remake the world. That was the way to the new world. And Christ rejected that. And Christ said, in essence, the only place for power was with the individual. The kingdom of God was within each individual. And we've forgotten to a great extent that over 2,000 years of Christian endeavour, there's been an attempt, particularly in the English-speaking world, to implement that teaching. Jeremy Lee touched on Magna Carta. We've forgotten the message of Magna Carta. It concerned this thing called power. There were the 2 points of view. We had Caesar in the shape of King John. We had the barons, and I would put it to you, much more representative than our party political hacks of today are representing anybody except themselves. But the other group at Magna Carta are generally overlooked, and they were the spokesmen for the church, headed by the great Archbishop Stephen Langton. And who did they claim to speak for? They claimed to speak on the authority of God. And in essence, they said to Caesar, now listen, Caesar, as of course Christ had said, we need Caesar, because we're going to see, we've got to, in orderly society, have government. But we don't want so much Caesar, there's nothing left to render unto God. So there is a higher law, said the bishops. And you, Caesar, must obey that higher law along with everybody else. Here was the struggle, the fundamental cleavage. And that is why Magna Carta, which of course is not taught these days, and some kids even think it might be an obscure racehorse if you mention it, they've never heard about it. One of the most tremendous documents, a great Christian document restating what regretfully today we've forgotten. What I'm putting to you, we better start to relearn those tremendous lessons if we're going to come out of this difficult period which Jeremy Lee explained we're going into. Power and authority. We had to accept the authority of God. All flowed from there. Caesar in his correct place, division of power. The individual had fundamental rights which he didn't obtain from the state. You see, many people tell me, well, look, the Soviet Union's got a nice sounding constitution. It lays down all the rights of the individual. Then you ask, well, where do you get those rights from? From the state. Well, what the state grants, the state can take away. But as you all know, God's rights, God's freedoms He's given to us are quite free. A completely different type of authority. Now, over history, we can see how this works out. We come to the test. By their fruits ye shall know them. You know, there is tremendous wisdom in the New Testament. Tremendous wisdom, if we just look at it. By their fruits, not by what they say, not by what they promise. What are their fruits? If the fruits are bitter, well then the philosophy's wrong. As I say, if you're getting thistles, you're obviously growing thistles, not growing figs. That is the acid test. And it's most important we keep, to use a colloquialism, our eye on the ball as we come to look at this a little further. Now, throughout history, the two policies from the two philosophies. Let's have a look at the one where you centralize power. Now, this produces something which has been summarized in a law. You've probably all heard it. Let's repeat it. The great law concerning power, enunciated by the great Christian historian and philosopher, Lord Acton. And I might just remind you, as I remind my Roman Catholic friends, this statement was made in a letter to his friend Lord Crichton when he was, as a devout Catholic, objecting to the doctrine of infallibility concerning the Holy Father. It's important to bear this in mind. This law, as Acton said, applies to everybody. And the law was, all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now that law tested over history is just as absolute as the law of gravity. You can, if you're a liberal-minded person, say, well, look, I don't like that law. It ought not to be like that. And you've got freedom to fight if you like. Like the individual, he can keep jumping over the cliff if he likes and say, well, look, I just reject this law of gravity. Well, he'll find every time he jumps, he'll hit the ground. And as the great G.K. Chesterton said, very witty, most poets seem to have a greater insight, the man that jumps over the cliff not only violates the law of gravity, but he demonstrates the truth of it. Do you know that's what we're doing today in our civilization? The plight of the world is demonstrating the truth of God's universe. We're demonstrating it every day. It's just a question of when we wake up and say, well, look, it's rather silly to keep on jumping over the cliff. But some people are not very bright, particularly those who are convinced, well, perhaps we just haven't got enough power yet. If we only had a bit more. So as Acton said, they become corrupted. And he said that applies to everybody, and I don't care who he is. It's rather interesting, you know, if you talk to politicians, particularly party politicians, I generally find when they're in opposition they agree with this law. And they'll tell you, well, yes, of course, it's true, yes, that bunch of sons, they've been in office far too long. They're quite corrupted. But if only we had the power, think of the good we could do with it. But it applies to all of us. It applies to all of us, and I could give you some quite devastating examples of individuals who set out with this liberal view, just wanted a little bit of power, going to do good with it, and the further they went, the more corrupt they became. Now, there's one aspect of this corruption that's generally overlooked. Many people can see that it corrupts the person who's using the power, becomes more and more arrogant, self-willed, and full of his own importance, becomes God. But there's another aspect. It corrupts those over whom the power is used. You see, if you are governed by someone else, you don't make any decisions yourself, you then are being corrupted. I hope I don't upset anyone. The traditional Christian objection to drunkenness has not been on health grounds, because without giving you a lecture on that subject, we do a lot more dangerous things to our bodies with some of the rubbish we eat than consuming alcohol. The traditional objection was the drunkard surrenders control of himself, control of purpose. That's what we're doing today. If we keep surrendering our lives to Caesar, Big Brother, or someone else, you're being corrupted. Until eventually you may even reach that dreadful state, and that must be the most dreadful of all, as the writer put it, the slave can come to love his chains. What a dreadful level that must be. So the law of power and corruption is an absolute. It's as absolute as the law of gravity, any other laws you care to define. Yes, it takes a while to work out. That is why the question of history is so important. Real history. I've given a little story, it's rather humorous perhaps on this, of the lecturer, full of his own importance, real liberal, rejected all authority, on the blackboard was going to prove to the students the law of gravity was nonsense. That fellow that discovered it, you know, the apple fell on his head, and all those people, that's a lot of nonsense. I'm going to prove it. And then he said, much to their astonishment, I'm going to now demonstrate. So up he went onto the 50th floor. The students were all waiting, and he jumped off. And as he went past the 40th floor, he waved to them all, and he said, quite all right. And he was at that point, but he wasn't a couple of minutes later. You've all heard the statement of the mills of God grind slowly, but they do grind. So sometimes it's like if you violate how you should treat your body, it may take a while before it catches up with you. But eventually it does, but it takes time. That is why these tremendous principles, truths, have got to be discussed in a time context. And that is why the church, which Jeremy Lee referred to, should be a body of authority on such matters. It's one of the reasons it should never have vacated, for example, the field of education to Caesar. That's one of the results of the abdication everywhere. These are questions I think we've got to give a lot of thought to. So you can take either course: centralised power with all the corruption, more and more compulsion, more and more tyrannical government, until eventually you get complete dissatisfaction, or the other policy, rooted in the other philosophy, that's the individual that counts. Therefore, we build from there. Caesar exists to serve the individual. Institutions exist to serve the individual. The group exists to serve the individual. And now we associate not under compulsion, but under the great Christian law of love. And I would agree with, again, Jeremy Lee, that statement concerning love. It's not one of those silly sentimental things like you read in all these novels today. It is a brilliant truth. It works. It works when you apply it. Any group that's come together through voluntary association because the individuals are attracted towards achieving something they couldn't get on their own, that is a tremendous success. There's harmony. The other policy produces disaster. Now, just one final point on this, because it's associated with our contemporary world, where instead of using words, as Bacon put it, to get a just relationship between the mind and things, we now throw words at people like slogans. You're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're an extremist, you're a racist. These are all slogans. This obscures reality. But as I said, you don't change reality by putting different words on it. Many years ago in America, back in the Great Depression of the 30s, there was a famous demagogue. He was assassinated, a chap called Huey Long. I merely give it this because as a young man I was most struck by this. And Long predicted the day would come when America would go under fascism. But he said they won't call it fascism. They'll call it democracy. You see, the Soviet Union, if you believe the words, is the most advanced democracy in the world. It must be. It says so. It's the people's democracy. Let me give you another analogy, what I'm trying to get across. In my part of the world, where we have a few fox problems, lambing time, we use poison, we use strychnine and poisoning. And the form in which we obtain it is pinkish powder. It rather looks like icing sugar. Now, supposing you put that in a bottle and you label it icing sugar, it looked like icing sugar. But I can assure you, if you had a teaspoon of it, the label wouldn't help you one bit. You don't change reality by putting a different label on it. Many people were astonished after the Second World War in East Germany, when large numbers of Nazi officials became communist officials. There was no difference. All they had to do was change the label. The reality was just the same. They were motivated by the same philosophy. The Hitler movement recruited a large number of its supporters from communists. The fascists in Italy, Mussolini was a Marxist one day. That's important, that you don't change reality by putting a different label on it. It's the reality itself we've got to look at. And therefore, to conclude this little part of the lecture, I don't care what the label you put on government. The more it centralises power, the greater the corruption. The more you take from the individual that which belongs to God. The more you corrupt him, the more you produce dissatisfaction in society. It takes a while sometimes to work out. Some of you would recall the great battles about the British entry into the common market. Again, all the idealists, but behind them were the hard-nosed people, the idealists said this is a marvellous vision. It should work. It ought to work. Look at the coming togetherness and all the rest. There were those who said, as I was one of them I recall, who said, but look, you can't get figs from thistles. The end result must be disastrous. 20 years later, if you had a vote in Britain today, 80% would say we've had enough of it. It's taken them 80 years to realise you don't get figs from thistles. They turned their back on their own traditions, the undergirding philosophy of Christianity, which gave rise to their political system, and much else. And I would direct your attention on this question. It's most important. A little book called Foundations of Liberty by the Reverend, these days, Canon Arthur Fellows, who examines this historically from a Christian viewpoint. Christians, may I stress, must concern themselves with real history. If we don't know how we've come to where we are, if we don't know of the great successes we've achieved, then how do we know where we're going? What have we got to offer the next generation that are so tormented at the moment of where they're going, cut off from their roots? This is absolutely essential for those of you who are going to play any effective role in the battle that's taking place in the world today. Well, now, if we can see this, the next point is very simple. The real argument for what we call democracy is the decentralisation of power, where individuals freely are making decisions about their own affairs. And to take it from there, the realities of the world are such that we have discovered principles. These truths, which, as I said, transcend human thinking, and when we apply them, they work. And it's amazing how often we do work them without realising we're working them. Now, let's take a little simple analogy. Supposing we're a group of people, if you can be imaginative for a while, imagine you're like little children again, we all thought up games and imagined things. Let's imagine we're a maroon group of people on one of those idyllic Pacific islands and we're all living happy ever afterwards. And after a period we decide, well, apart from eating and drinking and all the things that go with the material things of life, we'd like to do other things. We'd like to play some game. So we decide, well, now what could we play? We're different sexes, different ages. So someone says, well, what about golf? I remember we used to play golf. All right. Now, the important thing is, before we can play golf, we've got to do something. We've got to form a golf club. You see, we've got to form an association so we as individuals can get what we call a profit, or the increment of association. You see, that's another part of the truth of this universe. So the next thing we do is we decide, all right, we're going to form a golf club so we can play golf. The next thing is we've got to have something called a constitution. And the constitution can be either written or unwritten, but it lays down the rules. And we all agree to subscribe to the rules. How we're going to elect the committee and how you're going to run the club and so on. So we elect the committee, and then taking our minds ahead, they decide, all right, we've got to get the facilities for playing golf, so you've got to get bulldozers in if you had the equivalent, clear down the bush and put down the little putting greens and that little hole, which I generally find are far too small myself. And then you've got a social side, so you've got to have a golf clubhouse, and when it's all ready, we can all then go and play golf. Now, please note, there's no nonsense, all golfers are equal, because I can assure you they're definitely unequal. I'm one of the most unequal ones of all. But note the beauty of the association inside a framework of principle. Each individual can play the game in accordance with his attributes or his interest. If you think you're a budding Gary Play, you can go down and put in all the time you like, or if you're just a housewife that like a few social afternoons with the rest of the girls, or if you're a businessman that just wants to chat over a business deal, you can all play. Everybody's satisfied. Now, of course, the game itself's got some rules. They're very simple. In fact, there's only, I think, 7 words. The ball shall be played where it lays. I'll tell you, those 7 words have caused a lot of trouble, a lot of people. You see, and then on top of that, there's something called an ethic. It used to apply to cricket, but cricket, like everything else, has been reduced to a lower level. We used to talk about it's not cricket. That's the spirit. Sportsmanship. The Anglo-Saxon used to pride himself on that once. So in the case of golf, you know, if the ball's in the rough when your opponent's not looking, you don't give it a little kick. And if everybody plays within that, we all get satisfaction. The good player, the bad player, the indifferent player. It works. That is the type of association which reflects reality, serves the individual. Well, now, to hasten along, let us imagine one day a group of officials are taken to one of those special courses they have these days in universities where they study something called sociology. And there they're convinced this game of golf is very reactionary. It's really quite bad for people. In fact, it's been proved in the higher scientific circles it produces traumas. You've heard of all those things that sociologists preach, you know, about parents that smack their children, all these dreadful things. And really, it's your duty now with this higher knowledge to go back and stop that game immediately. In fact, to tell them it's been proved conclusively that baseball's far superior, that does a lot of things for everybody. Now, you imagine if the group come back and said, now, with this higher knowledge, we know what's good for you. So it's golf out and baseball in. Well, I suppose the first reaction would be, well, let's have a look at the Constitution. What's the special provision in the Constitution to call an urgent meeting and vote these idiots out? Well, supposing it's difficult to vote them out, the other thing you could do, if you've got freedom of choice, you just pick up your golf clubs and you say, well, cheerio. And all the members leave the club, and the club no longer serves them, so there's no longer the necessity for a club. Now, if you can quickly transport yourselves from there to, shall we say, a society like the Soviet Union, you can see where what we're talking about works out. Because there, those that have got the power have decided, because societies we're going to see is just simply a complex association of human beings, they've all got to play the equivalent of baseball in the Soviet Union. They can't change the committee because the committee's got all the guns, and they can't pick up the equivalent of their clubs and leave because there's an iron curtain. They've got to stay and play baseball or the equivalent whether they want to or not, and people that are compelled to do things they don't want to do don't do it very well. Now, if you'll grasp those correct principles of association, we can now come to the final stage of this lecture, where what we call our society is only a complex association, where over history individuals have learned how to come together to achieve in association what they couldn't get as individuals. It's fascinating, you know, to study the growth of civilization. You go back first to the simple tribes. They had to keep shifting the crop of the herd, at least their animals. You'll recall the biblical and other stories, to where the food was. But then in the Middle East, the Euphrates Valley, the Nile Valley, a great discovery was made. Crops could be grown in the one place. Grown because it was discovered that God's universe is an abundant universe. Have you ever thought about the Lord's Prayer where we're asked, give us this day our daily bread? Surely Christ didn't ask us to pray for our daily bread or the equivalent, the material things of life, if the Father hadn't provided an abundance. He has. The problem, as Jeremy Lee said about the world, is not a world of scarcity. It's not a mean, miserable world. It's a world overflowing not only with God's love, but his abundance. And they discovered it. And as they discovered the abundance, and again, let us make this point. The discovery of truth, Jeremy Lee touched on that, because it's important to remember there's another God being elevated by the liberals and the market called science. What science has done, ladies and gentlemen, science is merely the discovery of what was. Man doesn't create, man discovers. That gives a new relevance to that saying of seek the truth, and the truth will make you free. And the more truth we discover, the greater we can expand the physical basis of freedom. It's fascinating, you know, that even the terms we use can be misleading, such as the generation of electricity, as if we've created something. All we've done is change that which has already existed. But we've discovered truth, and so as we discovered more and more truth, the old question of poverty was slowly but surely shifted. More free time was available. So the individual could spiritualize himself. The arts, the crafts, all started to flourish. Which gives a new dimension, doesn't it, to God's universe. The whole subject of what is the true purpose of the production system? Does it exist to serve the individual? Or, as the communists say, to control the individual? Well, the Christian's got to have an answer. He's got to have an answer on what is called unemployment. Is it a curse? Or is it a manifestation of discovering so many of God's truths that fewer people in the production system provide an abundance for all? Doesn't that mean then, under proper conditions, every individual who's God's child's got a right to live with dignity? And God's made it available. And it all comes back to understanding these principles. So then we reach the stage with a developed society. First of all, in the middle, we've got economics. Well, we've discovered that private property is linked with that philosophy of decentralized power. The ownership of something is essential for each individual to develop himself. Even if it's his own little cottage, which he can paint in his own way, decorate in his own way. It may be very humble, but it belongs to that little family, and through it, they develop themselves. You see, the test of any concept is, does it work again? Without going into it in this lecture, communism as a system's a complete failure because it's contrary to truth. It's often overlooked. The first communists, in the economic sense, in the North American continent, were the Pilgrim Fathers. I like to tell Americans this one. And they're amazed. Do you know they tried economic communism? And they nearly came to complete disaster in spite of the fact they were God-fearing and Christian. But human nature is such. The man that had no family said, why should I work as hard as that character there that's got 8 children? They nearly came to disaster. And they had to then go back to a system of private property. Each individual personally responsible for that which he was going to operate. Then they started to flourish. And it doesn't matter what the property may be. It's not property as such which corrupts, it's the misuse of it. Private property. Then, if we accept what works, the consumer has got to control it. Well, we have something called the money vote. We'll be having a look at that. And money is a vote. Now, there's no argument the free enterprise system of economics has provided access to God's abundance on a scale that just dwarfs the imagination. The bread of life aspect's been solved. But, we were told, man does not live by bread alone. He's got to have more than bread, all right? So he's got to have freedom. But before he can do that in society, he's a social animal, he's got to live together. Like our golf club, so he's got to have government. That's all government is, a equivalent of the golf club committee. Then you've got to have a constitution to govern it, because the reality of history has taught us that governments, once they get a little power, want more power. So the Christians got to have a view on this. And our Christian forebears did have those views because they were taught. They needed Caesar, but not too much of him. And it's rather, to me, interesting that in the English world, we built up that Trinitarian concept of government. That's, to me, fascinating. The House of Commons, the lower house, then an upper house to check, divide the power. And originally the House of Lords was both Lords temporal and Lords spiritual. And you may be amazed to know this, that up until 1917, Christianity was accepted as part of the unwritten Constitution of England. It was then abolished as part of the New Enlightenment. And on top of that, we've got that other part of our constitutional system called the constitutional monarchy. And again, it's a great tragedy that few can put forward a case for the retention of monarchy, its Christian background, and the role it should play in the type of government that's Christian. Along with this, we have, as Jeremy Lee said, the independent judiciary. Government should be responsible for defence. But government should be confined to merely, as with the golf club, seeing the rules governing the club are maintained with the maximum freedom for individuals inside the club to get on with the game of life. So over here, that's where the real game of life is played. The third division, the cultural or spiritual. That's where the great advances have been. You see, all true progress is moral progress. All true progress is moral progress. It doesn't tell us much to say we've invented a plane now that cuts 4 hours off flying from here to New York. The question is, what do we do with the 4 hours we've saved? That's the question. Do we spiritualize our lives more with this free time? Or do we merely have the free time years to put us to do some more material activity under the control of someone's got the power to do it? Sporting activities, the arts, service to one another, through the Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, all of this is where the real progress of man's taken place. It's a vast subject. Look at the subject, for example, of the arts. Isn't this where all the real progress has been made, coming from individuals? Can anybody imagine a government department writing the plays of Shakespeare? Or perhaps the great paintings of Michelangelo? These are all the flowering of individuals. Spirituality pouring out. And the tragedy is there's so much of it today that's still potential, it's crushed. Even sport itself reduced to the level of paid gladiators. You've all seen this. And to conclude, then, ladies and gentlemen, if we had a truly Christian society, that is one that reflects truth, that is the philosophy of truth, decentralized power, it would be one in which economics and politics would be kept to their true place, which is to serve the individual, so in that third aspect of his affairs, he can get on with the real game of life, motivated by that Christian teaching of love. And I agree with what Jeremy Lee says, to have that vision requires not a mechanic, detailed blueprint of how you're all going to live, but a tremendous faith in a tremendous adventure.